The reflection. It was late when Emma returned to her apartment, the kind of late where the streets were empty and even the city's usual hum seemed muffled. She lived on the top floor of an old building, a place she could never quite get used to, with creaky floors and flickering lights. The hallway smelled faintly of mildew, and the walls, cracked and peeling, made her feel as though the building itself was slowly crumbling, like it was holding something back. When she reached her door, she noticed the handle was slightly turned, as though someone had been inside. She froze. She was sure she'd locked it when she left that morning. A tight knot formed in her stomach, but she pushed it aside. Maybe she'd just forgotten. She stepped inside, and the cold, stale air greeted her like an unwanted guest. Everything seemed normal at first. Furniture in its place, dishes in the sink, the faint buzzing of the refrigerator. But then she saw it. In the hallway mirror, just beyond her reflection, there was a shadow. It wasn't hers. Her heart skipped. She quickly turned her head, but the hallway was empty. She took a shaky breath, trying to calm her racing thoughts. It's just your mind playing tricks on you, she told herself. She'd been stressed lately, overwhelmed by work and life. She glanced back at the mirror. The shadow was still there. This time it was closer. Panic rose in her chest, and Emma's feet moved before her brain could catch up. She rushed into the kitchen, grabbed the knife from the block, and clutched it in her hand like a lifeline. Slowly, cautiously, she moved back into the hallway, her gaze locked on the mirror. Nothing, just her reflection. But then her reflection smiled. A slow, unsettling grin that wasn't hers. Her breath caught in her throat. She stumbled backward, slamming into the wall behind her, eyes never leaving the mirror. The smile in the reflection stretched wider, impossibly wide, until the edges of it seemed to tear at the corners of its mouth. The eyes glinted in the dim light, dark, hollow, and empty. In a panic, Emma turned and ran for the door, her hand shaking as she reached for the knob. It wouldn't budge. She yanked at it, desperate, but the door seemed locked from the inside. She pounded on it, screaming for help, but there was no one around to hear her scream. The reflection behind her moved again. This time it reached out from the mirror. Her blood ran cold. She felt cold fingers brush the back of her neck. She whirled around, but the mirror was empty. No reflection, no figure. The fear surged through her. Her mind began to fracture in tandem with the mounting terror. Her heart raced, and her pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out the faint, eerie sounds coming from within the walls. As Emma stood frozen, trapped between the door that wouldn't open and the shifting shadow in the mirror, her grip tightened around the knife. She couldn't tear her gaze away from the glass. Every part of her screamed to run, but she was paralyzed, her limbs heavy with dread. Then, something sharp and sudden, like the snap of a twig, echoed through the room. It was the mirror. A crack split down the middle of the glass, sharp and jagged, spreading like a lightning strike from top to bottom. The reflection of Emma wavered, the glass warping with the force of it. The grin in the reflection didn't shift with her movements, as it should have. Instead, it stayed, staring at her. The thing in the glass seemed to be aware. It knew her. Suddenly the mirror shattered, not in the usual way with a cascade of glass, but as though something inside had ripped through the surface. A low, grinding noise, like a weight dragging against the inside of the glass, tore through the air. The mirror split, its surface crumbling in on itself as though the reflection was pulling back, trying to escape. Then she saw it. A note on the floor, a pale scrap of paper she'd never seen before. In a hurried, jagged script it read, "You should have left when you had the chance." Emma's breath quickened as the air around her grew colder. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it a figure, standing just behind her, reflected in the glass of the broken hallway mirror. It happened so quickly that Emma didn't have time to process the reality of what was happening. The glass lay on the floor in a rain of fragments, but the figure behind her didn't vanish. It surged forward, extending from the fractured pieces, as though the shards had become a gateway. The reflection bled out into the room, becoming more solid, more real. until her reflection was no longer hers. It was someone else entirely, and it was grinning. Emma screamed, stumbling backward, and then the shadow stepped out of the wreckage of the mirror. It was no longer just a reflection. It was in her world now, its form dark and shifting, twisting in ways that made no sense. Emma was too terrified to move, too frightened to see if she could escape. But the last thing she saw before everything went black was its eyes. Empty, hollow, and smiling. The mirror had broken not from some accident, but from the thing within, desperate to be free. The apartment was silent now. All you could hear was the faint sound of a clock ticking in the corner. The shattered mirror, its glass scattered like jagged pieces of a forgotten nightmare, lay in a pool of broken reflection. The air, thick with the scent of dust and the cold, oppressive silence, seemed to hold its breath. Emma had vanished. Her neighbors would say she'd been acting strange for days before that night. Talking to herself in the hallway, eyes darting nervously at shadows, muttering about things she couldn't quite explain. But when they knocked on her door the morning after that terrible night, there was no answer. The landlord had the door opened, concerned by the strange silence that hung over the apartment. What they found inside was nothing more than an unsettling emptiness. No sign of struggle, no blood, no trace of Emma. Her belongings were still there, her coat draped over the chair, her books scattered across the coffee table. Everything was just as it had been the night before, except for the mirror. The hallway mirror was gone. In its place, there was a small note, hastily scrawled in red ink on a crumpled piece of paper. The handwriting was jagged, twisted, the words barely legible. She stayed too long. As the days passed, the rumors began to spread. People talked about the strange happenings in the building, the odd disappearances that had plagued the old apartment complex for years. The mirror was part of it, they said, something ancient, something cursed, a reflection that wasn't just a reflection. It was a doorway, portal, and once you stepped too close it would take you, slowly, piece by piece. But the scariest part was that, months later, a new tenant moved into Emma's apartment. It was a young woman, bright-eyed, unaware of the apartment's history. She was drawn to the empty space, the promise of cheap rent in a city that swallowed up the young and the hopeful. She unpacked, settled in, and decorated the walls with pictures of her family, placed a potted plant on the windowsill. Everything seemed normal, except for one thing. The new tenant found the mirror, hidden in the closet. The cracked, shattered mirror, repaired now but with traces of the breaks still visible across its surface. She hung it in the hallway, right where it had been before. Seemed out of place, but she didn't mind. After all, mirrors had a way of making places feel more homey, didn't they? That night, as she passed the mirror, she caught a glimpse of herself, standing there, half-turned, her reflection staring back. But it didn't look quite right. The reflection smiled at her, and in that smile she saw something else. A dark, hollow figure behind her, standing still, waiting. Her own eyes widened in terror, and for a moment she thought she saw it move just a little bit. A whisper of cold air brushed her neck, and she turned slowly, but there was nothing there. Not yet, but the reflection, it was already waiting for her. And somewhere, deep inside, she realized with horror what was truly happening. The mirror never let go. It only passed its curse on. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Like and subscribe if you're into scary stories like me. Let me know down below what kind of stories you like to hear more from. Then all I've left to say is, stay safe and you'll hear me back tomorrow.